we got as far as moving to University of Toronto and connecting up with David Turner in Toronto. And at that period of time, David was developing. Uh, this is it was in process developing a lot of the theoretical ideas, which, looking back, of course, are now more or less fully formed. Um, what was going on is he'd started, of course, with his work in Australia. He worked in Groot Eland with the can't say it, Anandil in Australia, and he wrote this book, which is called Australian Aboriginal Social Organization, and what it does is it lays out few limited principles upon which Australian Aboriginal Social Organization is based, and then it works out what all the variations are. So it's a highly structuralist exercise, following very, very much from the kind of things that Levi Strauss had written about in Elementary Structures of Kinship. I often joke that I'm probably the only person in the English Academy anymore who's actually read at Elementary Structures of Kinship, and I could probably still do a lecture on it if I thought about it, but everybody else claims to have read it, but I'm not sure that they actually have. But it was based on those kind of notions. It was a critique of what Levi Strauss says in Elementary Structures of Kinship, but it was also developing that. And so he laid out the notion in Australia that it was founded upon these clearly and discreetly defined landowning groups where they own specific pieces of territory. That those membership in those landowning groups is patrilineal throughout Australia. You have to get into. I know you have to get into some finer work on what they mean by patrilineal. He does that, but I'm not gonna follow that. Those patrilineally defined landowning groups have two sets of exchanges. The landowning groups are linked together via what we call song lines through the mythology, through the stories. They're linked together into sort of chains of landowning groups. And essentially goods flow along those chains. One of the things about the landowning groups in Australia is that no group can be self-sufficient. No group owns enough land that they could actually be self-sufficient. In fact, they usually own a specific resource on the land, and so therefore they have to trade that resource with everybody else. So along the song lines, along the mythological lines, are go economic exchanges, and between the landowning groups you have marriage exchanges, and the classic marriage exchanges. It's still phrased in those days, although I know there's critique since of the clans exchanging women. But those principles that sort of 4 or 5 principles David lays out at the beginning of the book, and then he essentially says that the marriage exchanges can happen every generation. That's a Carriera system. Every alternate generation, that's an Aranda system. Or every third generation, that's a Barty system. And that's kind of the limit, because you can't go for another generation of exchanges and have people remember all the relationships. So basically, those are the 3 core systems. And what he does in the book is lays those out. And then he goes on to talk about what were the anomalous systems, or apparently anomalous systems, in Australia. And what he argues, the Murngan is the famous case. It was written up by a guy called, I think it was called Warner. Now I've forgotten. But anyway, Murngan is a classic case. And what David argued in his book was that, in fact, if you are changing from an exchange every generation, a Carriera type system, to an Aranda type system, in the middle of that process of changing, it comes out looking like a Murngan, what they described as a Murngan system. So that's basically the idea. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic idea that we needed here. When I was in 4th year as an undergraduate, we did a seminar on, and I'll probably forget it now, asymmetric patrilateral exchange systems, which, as you probably already are well aware, don't exist. So the question was, I mean, they exist theoretically. Anthropologists can generate this theoretically, but they don't actually exist in practice. And there's a whole argument. There had been a whole argument at the time about why this was the case, and we we did what David wanted to do was look at the cases that were in Australia and try and work out, given the kind of theory that I just gave you, what was why were these things coming up looking like these asymmetrical systems. So we in fact did a course when I was in fourth year, a seminar course where we actually each one of us took one of these systems in Australia and sort of worked through it using the ideas that David had outlined in his theory of theory of Australian social organization, and it was actually really a fun course. A lot of hard work because you had to pull together the theory, and it was at that time the main fight between Needham, which Needham had led, was over, but it still had to work out the case studies, right? So it was a really, really good exercise. It was sort of a very technical exercise in kinship analysis. The funny thing about doing that course is that the next year, when I went on to my graduate program, I was sitting with the graduate director. The graduate director was a guy called Suiji Nagata at the time. And Suiji was going over my courses, what I'd done, and therefore what I would need to do in graduate school. And he looked at this course and he said, and he looked at the title of it and he said, "Who the hell authorized this course?" And I told him who had authorized it. He said, "But there's no such thing." And I said, "Well, I know." And he just burst out laughing, and then we continued on the discussion. That was the kind of very technical work we were doing with David. We were working on some of those issues around kinship and social organization. But what had since happened is David took that theory and he did a kind of mental exercise. So still in the heart of structuralism here. Did a mental exercise of what happens if you take all of those principles and invert them. Turn them upside down. What does it look like if you do that? And in that mental exercise, well, he'd actually done this the year before, but when you do that inversion, it comes out looking very, very much like, and the case study that he picked up on was Bill Dunning's book, Social and Economic Change Amongst the Northern Ojibwa. It comes out looking awfully like a Cree and Ojibwa, Cree or Ojibwa kinship system. And that was quite startling, okay? So he had actually had a student from the University of Manitoba, a guy called Paul Wertman, go up to Shamattawa in northern Manitoba to kind of do an initial test on this hypothesis to see if it actually worked. The idea in this case is that whatever your landowning group is, your landowning group has sufficient access or access to sufficient territory to provide for all of its resources, all of its needs internally. And so that in fact, the relationships among the local social groups are based on sort of co-residence and co-production relationships. It's a co-production kind of model, and in fact, what the relationship system, the kinship system, reflects is the history of those co-production relationships over time, over a bounded area of land. And so that was the kind of model that he proposed, and as I said, a reading of Bill Dunning's book suggested that that's what was going on with the Ojibwe, and the study that Paul Wertman did, and Paul and David later wrote up in a book on Shamattawa. The study that Paul Wertman did kind of refined and reinforced that notion. I always remember David when he was working on that book with Paul. The initial title of the book was called The Boys in the Band, until David realized that it wasn't just the boys in the band, it was actually the boys and the girls in the band. And so he had to sort of change his thinking about that. As he as these notions developed, David came to characterize them under two terms. One was a federative model, so that's the Australian Aboriginal notion, was a federative model, where you have these distinct small landowning groups that in order to support themselves, have to create federative relationships with each other, both through economic exchanges and through marital exchanges. Then the other model was what he came to call incorporative. And the idea of incorporative was that if you start off with two distinct social bodies of whatever kind, and we can come back to that, that when those two bodies come together, they merge into and form a single social unit. So the distinct unit disappears and they become one. In marriage, and this particularly shows up in marriage relationships, that at least in the Cree context, that when a man and a woman marry, they merge together and they form a new identity, a new social unit. Of course, we're talking about the time in the West when, at those days when you got married, the woman would become incorporated into the man's social identity in the West, but not in the Cree context. They'd form a new social unit. In the Australian Aboriginal context, when a man and a woman got married, they continued to maintain their original clan relationships. They never lost or changed their original clan relationships. They were still there. And so they never merged together into a kind of a single social unit. So that was the notion of incorporation that David developed. Now, the problem was, the other thing, by the way, I just have to note, because a lot of people don't remember this anymore. Bill Dunning's book, Social and Economic Change Amongst the Northern Ojibways, is actually quite an interesting book. Bill Dunning had studied under Edmund Leach at Cambridge, and so he had picked up on some of the structural notions of social organization. And in that book, Bill Dunning suggests that the difference between parallel cousins and cross cousins, and he has a whole thing about parallel cousins and cross cousins, that his argument is that the actual effect of that distinction is to create a marriageable cross cousins, marriageable group versus an unmarriageable group. So it's within the context of the band to create that division between a category that allows for marriage, which was, by the way, a very radical notion and one that's not actually picked up on very often in the literature. So that's one of the things that David picked up on in there. So, but the problem is, if you're dealing with these kind of pragmatic co-production, co-residence type systems, and if David was right about those principles, what are the variations? How does it work? And analytically and theoretically, there was no particular way for us to think out what the variations could be, because it's based on pragmatic circumstances. It's based on sort of the history of production circumstances. So what would the variations look like, if there were any? And that's where we were sort of, as I'm going in through fourth year university and coming into graduate school. What are the possible variations on these systems? And really the only way to test it was to test it empirically. So at that time there were about 6 of us. Well, there were a couple of others, but but there were about 6 of us who were studying and working with David. And essentially what David did is lined the 6 of us up and said, okay, you go do West Coast, you go do Dene, you go do Iroquois, you go do Inuit, and that's, of course, the finger pointed at me. You deal with Inuit. And so our job was to sort of test across the various groups across Canada what they were. I can't remember all of the people who were involved in that. I can only tell you that there was Guy Lanoux, who worked with the Secondary, who then went on and taught at Université de Montréal, and there was Bob Adlam, who worked with the Tahltan. He went on and taught at, still teaches at Mount Allison. but I can't remember who the others were in that group now. Um, and then there was me that did the was to do the Inuit. So on the basis of that kind of designation, I'm sure David would deny that it was that kind of. But these are still in the days when you did what your doctoral supervisor told you to do. The idea that you came up with your own idea in doctoral thesis was fairly limited, right? So we didn't have a whole lot of choice. So what I did in that was my fourth year. Um, Now this is when things get a little complicated. Uh, at U of T, you couldn't actually do an honors degree. They didn't have an honors degree at U of T. However, I was at Trinity College, and Trinity had an option where you could do a thesis in fourth year. It was worth 12 credits, so it was quite a massive piece. And so in my fourth year, I did an honors thesis, which was a survey of Inuit social organization based on the kind of principles we'd been working on. If you want, I don't recommend it, but if you want, you can go and look that up. That's still sitting in the Trinity College Library at the University of Toronto. We had to file our theses with the college library, so it's still there. I would ask that nobody go and look at it, please, because it was very much an undergraduate attempt.